This is The Creative Funding Show, a podcast for authors, YouTubers, and podcasters who want to fund the work they love without selling out.
Welcome to the first ever Creative Funding Show episode. My name is Thomas Umstattd, and in this episode 0, I'd like to introduce myself. So if you don't care about me, you're welcome to skip this show. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about my background and why I'm doing this show. So the Creative Funding Show is a podcast for creators who want to make a living doing what they love using platforms like Patreon and Kickstarter, sponsorships, and more. And our goal is to be primarily an interview show, talking with creators to learn how they fund their work, talking with industry insiders about the tools that they're making to make creators' lives better, and also doing deep dives, individual episodes with me answering your questions about funding, creating, and thriving as a creator. But in this episode, I'm going to talk about myself, which is in general not a goal of the show. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about me, but I do want to kind of share my story of how I got to be talking into this microphone to you right now. So I've been buzzing on the outskirts of the creative community for a long time. The first YouTube video of me went up in 2006. So as of this recording, that was 12 years ago. And I remember in 2006 being so surprised at YouTube as a platform and how seamless the experience was. I don't know if any of you can remember before the days of YouTube, we watched videos with Real Player and it was awful. Real Player was the worst and YouTube was 1 million times better. There's a reason why you don't install Real Player on your computer anymore. And it's because everything has gotten better than that since then. I started my first podcast in 2007. It was about video game addiction. It's since pod faded, sadly. I don't even know if I have the recordings anymore. But I had no idea what I was doing back then. But I did enjoy doing it. I'd been listening to podcasts and I loved podcasting. And I had fun buying my first equipment, and I was doing my editing at GarageBand back when GarageBand was actually good for podcasting. Those days were good. In 2013, I started my first Kickstarter campaign for a WordPress plugin that we were developing at the time called My Book Table. It's a plugin that allows you to add a bookstore to your WordPress website if you're an author. It's very popular amongst authors. In fact, it's tied for number 1 in the most popular bookstore plugin for authors. And at the time, we didn't know if there was an audience for it. We'd been using a version of this plugin internally when we would build websites for authors. We used it to save ourselves time, and we weren't sure if there was a demand amongst authors generally for people who wanted to buy the plugin. So we put it on Kickstarter. We had a goal of $2,500, I believe, and we ended up raising over $12,000. So the answer to the question, does the world want this plugin, was a resounding yes. Yes, the world wants this plugin. So we launched My Book Table, and it's still an active plugin. It's in active development for the last 5 years. We've gone through quite a few changes and improvements. We've added a lot of features, and it's now a very robust and fairly mature software. In 2013, I also started the Novel Marketing Podcast with James L. Rubart. It's still an active podcast. In fact, this was the podcast that led to me embracing this show. More on that in a bit. In 2014, I crowdfunded a course on crowdfunding on Indiegogo. So after I did My Book Table on Kickstarter, in rapid succession, I did a bunch of other crowdfunding campaigns, both with myself and with others, all of which succeeded. So I had a 100% success rate on Kickstarter, and people kept asking me for advice on crowdfunding. And so in part to get them to shut up, I basically took everything I knew and put it into a course in 2014. And that course, I didn't realize this at the time, but many people had tried crowdfunding courses on crowdfunding and they had all failed. So I was trying to do something that no one to that point had succeeded in doing. And with the help of Mary DeMuth, my co-teacher in the course, we successfully crowdfunded a course on crowdfunding, which was very meta. We had lots of inception jokes. It was lots of fun. And we've gotten some great feedback from that course. And it's been fun occasionally somebody will send me a book that they've crowdfunded on Kickstarter or Indiegogo. It was, of course, primarily for authors. And in 2014, I joined Patreon as a patron. So I've been a fan of Pamplemousse for years. It's back when Jack Conte was just a musician who I remember being impressed with all of the different instruments he could play in his Pamplemousse songs. And I loved their music. I would buy their songs on iTunes. And so when they went on Patreon, it was a no-brainer. And I was very impressed with Patreon as a platform. So I'm a Kickstarter person originally. That's my background. But when I looked at Patreon, I was like, I get it. I see the appeal of getting a little bit of money every month rather than a huge lump sum of money only after you do this exhausting Kickstarter campaign. And so part of the reason I backed Pamplemousse was, because I was fans of them. But to be honest, the other bigger reason I backed them was because I just wanted to observe Patreon. I wanted to watch how Patreon was growing as a platform, how people were using it. And I slowly started backing different campaigns and different creators on Patreon and kind of seeing what they were doing. In 2015, I crowdfunded my first book. So I'd crowdfunded other people's books, but I did my own book on dating and relationships. It was based off of a viral blog post that I wrote. And I didn't really want to write the book. I kind of did, but I was like, okay, world, if you want this book, make the money happen. And the readers of my blog made the money happen. So I spent most of 2015 writing the book that they wanted me to write and researching it and recovering from writing it. It was lots of drama and great fun. And but they raised $11,000 to help make the book possible. And it was another learning curve of, learning how to crowdfund. And it's a different world. Crowdfunding in 2015 was different from what it was in 2013, and it's different than it is now. Kickstarter is maturing as a platform, and backers are getting more sophisticated. In 2016 to 2017, I guest hosted a radio show from time to time. And in the summer of 2017, I actually quit my job and did radio full time for a while, which was a great experience. I got to see how the traditional side of the industry worked. And I also got to see that I'm much happier in indie digital world than in traditional terrestrial world. So I'm much happier behind a podcasting microphone than I am behind a radio microphone. But I do love radio and do love talk radio. And in 2017, we kept podcasting on the Novel Marketing Show, and I started thinking about funding the show on Patreon. I talked with my co-host about it, James Rubart, and I went to look for a podcast about Patreon, and I couldn't find it. So there had been the Patreon podcast, and it pod faded. It only had 1 or 2 episodes that were downloadable, and it hadn't had any new episodes in years. And I was like, there needs to be a podcast primarily for Patreon. I kind of, early 2018, I was like, somebody needs to make this. And so finally I was like, maybe this should be me. In the meantime, I'd launched the Novel Marketing Patreon campaign. And we're currently around $150, $175 a month on that. It's a brand new campaign. I launched it this year without the help of a podcast about Patreon. So this, in a sense, this show is what I wish I had had when I launched our first Patreon campaign for Novel Marketing. So I realized the Novel Marketing page is nothing spectacular. It's a very niche podcast. It's a marketing podcast for authors and primarily for fiction authors. My hope is that this show will just appeal to authors, but also to YouTubers and podcasters. And my goal is not just to focus on Patreon, but also Kickstarter and also sponsorships and also other ways of bringing in revenue. If you have a creative way of funding your art, shoot me an email or reach out to me at creativefunding.show. We just might have you on the show to talk about how you're funding your art. And that's where we are now. I am launching this podcast. I don't know if it will take off. I don't know if you will like it. And I don't know what you're looking for. This is a brand new project for me, and I haven't launched a brand new project like this in a very long time. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm having fun making these episodes. I'm hoping that this show will be a blessing to you, a help to you as you fund your art. And I really do hope that together we can end starving artists, or at least reduce how much artists starve, and keep them from feeling like they have to sell out in order to make a living. Now, to be perfectly transparent, while I've been buzzing around the community for a long time, I am not right now an expert at Patreon. I've been a Patreon page owner for 2 months, a little over 2 months with the Novel Marketing Show. I've been a patron for years, but I've just been starting out as a creator on Patreon. So I'm going to be learning along with you. When I'm asking questions, trying to have that beginner's mind. And yes, I've been crowdfunding for a long time, but Patreon is a different animal. And I'm learning that. I'm going to be learning alongside of you. In terms of show format, the goal is to shoot for between 20 and 30 minutes per show. I want this to be the kind of show you can listen to while you're working out at the gym or driving to work. And if you know someone using Patreon or Kickstarter, I really need help here at the beginning getting guests. The longer the show goes and the more famous it becomes, the easier guests are going to be to find. But in the early days, this is where you come in to be particularly helpful. And I plan to interview both creators like you and industry professionals. So people who work at Patreon or YouTube, Graphtreon, really any tool that makes creating easier, makes raising money easier. I'd love to talk to those industry professionals, but I don't want to just talk to them. I want to hear stories from creators and from stories from all kinds of creators. So I don't just want to talk to veterans who are making, $10,000 a month. I also want to talk to people who are just getting started and are making $50 a month. They just got their first 20 backers and hearing their story, hearing what they're going through, what their challenges are. And the goal is to be encouraging. I want to encourage you, show you just how easy it is to start increasing your revenue on platforms like Patreon and Kickstarter and other ways of making money. So don't think that this is just the Patreon show. It's going to be primarily the Patreon show, but it's not going to only be about Patreon. There are other shows about Kickstarter, and they are good. So I feel like there's less need for me to talk about Kickstarter as Kickstarter rolls out its Drip platform, which is their direct competitor to Patreon. We'll be talking about that specifically. But right now, there's no one in the podosphere that I can find who's talking about Patreon. So that's going to be our primary emphasis, at least in these early days. But the show's going to evolve based off of your feedback. And to kick things off, I plan to do some introductory solo episodes as I find guests. I'll be filling the backlog with shows that are just me. But I plan to put into practice what I'm learning on the show. So in general, you don't necessarily want to launch a Patreon campaign right at the beginning of a new project. When you have no audience, you need the crowd before you can fund. But I'm going to break that rule and launch this podcast along with a Patreon campaign, partly so that those of you who are with me from the beginning can watch the process. So in the early days, we're not going to have a lot, but as we talk to people and as I learn, I'll be putting that advice directly into a Patreon campaign that'll be like our testbed, our guinea pig. And I think that'll be fun. I think it'll also help fund this show. I think it's important for the creative funding show to be funded itself. So we'll talk more about that Patreon page in a future episode. I'm actually thinking about doing the show, creating the page and kind of recording myself as I do it and giving my thoughts and feedback as I create a Patreon page from scratch. So listen for that in a future episode. And just finally, we're going to be on social media. The page has a Facebook page and a Twitter page. We'll have those links in the show notes. So if you just scroll down, you can find a link in the show notes or to the side. My goal is to have any link that we mention on this show. You don't have to remember how to spell it. The link will be in the show notes, which if you're listening on an app on your phone, you can just press with your finger. And if you're listening on the website, you can just click the link. So I'm hoping to make life easier for you in that way. And one final way that you can help this show is asking questions on creativefunding.show and leaving a review on iTunes. I can't tell you how helpful that is in the early days of a podcast. If you will have any hope of getting to new and noteworthy, you need reviews. So if you're willing to leave a review, it can be positive, it can be negative. Feel free to give me feedback through the reviews on iTunes. And thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate what you do to make the world a better place with the art that you make. To connect with me, go to creativefundingshow.com. Thanks for listening.